They spent 3 years making sure humans couldn't fight back legally. They forgot to check if humans cared. The treaty had a name. I remember the name. It sounds clean and administrative, like a filing code. We filed our objections. We filed them on schedule, through the correct channels, with all the required supporting documentation. The vote was called before our final statement finished. The chamber was already empty by the time the tally was announced. The treaty had a name. I remember the name. It sounds clean and administrative, like a filing code. Treaty 847-NCC. Non-Combatant Classification. 3 years of drafting. 3 years of committees that never convened. 3 years of objections that were recorded in perfect silence and filed in perfect order. I served on this station for 11 years. 11 years of watching the Empire's delegates arrive in their polished robes, their translators humming with the confidence of a species that had never needed to be afraid. 11 years of learning the exact weight of being small in a room full of beings who had forgotten what small felt like. My name is Kenji Tanaka, Senior Human Diplomatic Attaché, Station 7 Gamma, Conclave of Allied Systems. I was 43 years old when the treaty passed. I had been preparing for it longer than anyone knew. The final session was held in the main council chamber. The chamber itself is a thing of deliberate architecture, a vast circular space with tiered stone benches rising in concentric rings, each ring a little higher than the last, so that every delegate looks down at whoever stands at the center. The central table is black obsidian, polished to a mirror finish, cold under the palms. I had stood at that table 17 times over the course of the treaty's drafting. 17 formal objections. 17 times I had read the language of the proposed classification, explained how it would strip human vessels of their right to self-defense, how it would leave human colonies legally defenseless against any hostile action. 17 times the record had noted my words and moved on. The 18th time was the final vote. I had prepared a statement. It was not long, 3 minutes, carefully written, every clause cross-referenced to existing treaty law. I had spent 2 weeks on it, checking each citation against the Council's own archive, making sure that nothing I said could be dismissed as an error. I had a copy in my hand, printed on the thick paper the Council used for formal submissions, the watermark of the conclave's seal faintly visible in the corner. I did not finish reading it. The vote was called before my final statement finished. The presiding delegate, a tall being from the Empire's homeworld, pale gray skin, eyes that did not blink, raised a hand and said the words I had been dreading for 3 years. The chair recognizes that the allotted time for statements has concluded. The vote will proceed. The chamber was already empty by the time the tally was announced. Not physically empty. The other delegates were still in their seats, their attention already shifting to the next item on the agenda. But the chamber was empty in the way that matters. No one was listening. The vote was recorded, the treaty ratified, and the human delegation was informed that we would receive official documentation within 30 standard days. I folded my statement and put it in my pocket. The paper made a soft sound against the fabric. I walked out of the chamber through the main doors, my footsteps echoing in the high corridor, the sound of my own boots on the polished stone the only thing I could hear. The walk back to quarters took 12 minutes. I counted them. The station's corridors are designed to be disorienting to species that rely on visual landmarks. The walls curve in ways that do not match human expectations. The lighting shifts between bands of warm and cool. The ambient sound is a low harmonic hum that has nothing to do with the station's engineering systems. After 11 years, I had learned to navigate by the pressure differentials in the air, by the subtle changes in the vibration of the deck plates. I did not need to look up. The quarters themselves are small, a cabin with a narrow bed, a metal desk, a viewport that looks out onto a stretch of empty space between the station's outer hull and the nebula that gives this sector its distinctive red glow. I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my glasses. The wire frames had left marks on the bridge of my nose. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against my closed eyes and waited for the headache that I knew was coming. The station's automated systems cycled through their routines. The environmental controls hummed. The lights dimmed slightly as the station's internal clock shifted toward the rest cycle. I could hear the distant sound of the council chamber's cleaning drones beginning their nightly work. I did not move for a long time. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Quick, light footsteps. The rhythm of someone who walked with a fast, deliberate stride. I knew the pattern before the knock came. The door opened without waiting for my response. Seo-jun stood in the doorway, his gray hoodie unzipped, the silver chain around his neck catching the dim light. He was holding a datapad in his right hand, his thumb resting on the edge of the screen. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the display. "They are moving," he said. He held out the datapad. The screen showed a single line of text encrypted, the header identifying it as coming from the old relay, the one that had been dark for 40 years, the one the galaxy had forgotten existed. The message was 3 words. "They are moving." I took the datapad. My hand was steady. I had been expecting this message for 11 years. I had known, the moment the treaty was ratified, that it would come. The Empire had not spent 3 years drafting a legal framework for a species they intended to leave alone. They had built a cage, and now they were coming to lock the door. I set the datapad on the desk beside my folded statement. The paper was still in my pocket. I could feel the weight of it against my thigh. Seo-jun did not say anything else. He stood in the doorway, his hands now at his sides, his posture still but alert. He was 27 years old, a junior attaché with 3 years of service. He had been assigned to me as part of the standard rotation, and I had watched him learn the station's rhythms faster than most. He knew what the message meant. He did not need me to explain it. I looked at the viewport. The nebula's red glow was faint against the black. Somewhere out there, the Empire's fleet was already moving. They would arrive in 6 hours, maybe less. They would find a station that had just been legally stripped of its ability to defend itself. They would find a human delegation that had filed 17 objections and been ignored 17 times. They would find a species that had been classified as non-combatant, which meant that any resistance would be legally defined as an act of aggression. They had thought of everything. They had forgotten one thing. I reached under the bed and pulled out a small encrypted case. It was made of dark gray composite, the surface worn smooth from years of handling. I had brought it with me 11 years ago, when I first arrived on the station. I had kept it under a loose floor panel in the corner of the cabin, behind the desk. I had never opened it. The lock was a simple biometric scanner, keyed to my right thumb. I pressed my thumb against the pad and felt the click as the seal released. Inside was a single data rod, no larger than my index finger, and a handwritten note on a piece of paper that had yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was familiar. The precise, slightly angular script of Admiral Haruko Sato, the woman who had commanded the human diplomatic corps before her retirement. I had served under her for 6 years before I was posted here. She had given me the case on my last day in her office. The note said, "If you ever send the signal, we will answer. It will not be fast. It will not be subtle." I held the data rod in my palm. It was cool to the touch, dense, the surface marked with the faint etching of a frequency code I had memorized years ago. The old relay, the one that had been dark for 40 years. The one the galaxy had forgotten existed. Sao-Jun was still standing in the doorway. I looked up at him and saw that his face had not changed. He was waiting. I stood up, the data rod in my hand. I walked past him into the corridor, my boots making the same deliberate sound on the deck plates. The station's lights were dim, the corridors empty. The cleaning drones had finished their work and retreated to their charging stations. The only sound was the low harmonic hum of the environmental systems and the soft rhythm of my own footsteps. The old relay was in the maintenance section, 3 levels down, behind a panel that had not been opened in 40 years. I knew the code. I had known it for 11 years. The chamber was empty. The vote was final, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, something that had been waiting for this moment was already moving. The chamber was empty. The vote was final. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, something that had been waiting for this moment was already moving. I stood in the corridor outside the council chamber for exactly 47 seconds after the last delegate left. I counted because counting was something I could control. The station's environmental system cycled air through the vents with a sound like distant breathing. The lights dimmed to their night cycle setting, and the shadows stretched across the polished stone floor. Seo-Jun found me there. He did not speak. He simply stood beside me, his hands in the pockets of his gray hoodie, his breath visible in the cool air. We had worked together for 3 years. He knew when to wait. When I finally turned to walk back to my quarters, he fell into step beside me. The corridors were empty. The station had a population of 12,000, but at this hour, in this section, it felt like a tomb. My boots made a sound I had not noticed before, a hollow echo that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the floor. The younger colleague's datapad was in his right hand, the screen dark. He had not looked at it since we left the chamber. I knew what that meant. We reached my quarters. The room was small, a desk, a cot, a narrow viewport that looked out onto the station's inner ring. I had lived in this room for 11 years. I had memorized every crack in the ceiling panel, every faint discoloration in the wall fabric. The room smelled of recycled air and old paper and something I could never identify, a smell between dust and memory. Sao-Jun closed the door behind us. The lock engaged with a soft click. He held the datapad out to me, screen still dark, waiting for me to take it. I did not take it immediately. I removed my wire-rimmed glasses and cleaned them with the edge of my shirt. I had learned long ago that small rituals created space for the mind to catch up with what the body already knew. My hands were steady. They had been steady through the entire session, but I could feel the tremor waiting beneath the surface, patient as a held breath. The datapad was cold in my hands. I turned it over. The screen illuminated at my touch. 3 words. They are moving. I read them 3 times. The first time, they were just letters. The second time, they became a sentence. The third time, they became the sound of something breaking. I set the datapad face down on the desk. The room was very quiet. The station's automated systems cycled through their routines, and I could hear the faint hum of the environmental controls, the distant vibration of the main reactors, the occasional ping of a sensor relay. These were the sounds I had fallen asleep to for 11 years. They had become the texture of my life here. Seo Jun sat on the edge of the cot, his hands clasped between his knees, watching me. He did not ask what the message meant. He already knew. He had been the one to decrypt it, to verify the authentication codes, to confirm that it came from the one relay that was supposed to be dormant. I sat down at the desk. The chair was old, the padding compressed from years of use. I had spent thousands of hours in this chair, reading reports, drafting objections, preparing statements that no one would hear. The surface of the desk was scarred with the ghosts of work, faint circles from coffee cups, scratches from data pads, a small burn mark from a power adapter that had failed 4 years ago. The Empire's fleet would have launched the moment the treaty was ratified. That was the logic of it. The legal framework was in place. The classification was official. And now, somewhere between the stars, 47 warships were moving through a corridor that was supposed to be demilitarized. I had known this day would come. I had known it the first time I set foot on this station 11 years ago, when I was a junior attaché with a single datapad and a diplomatic pouch that contained nothing of value. I had known it when I attended my first council session and watched the Empire's delegates speak with the smooth, unhurried confidence of something that had never been challenged. I had known it every time I filed an objection that was acknowledged and ignored, every time I requested a meeting that was scheduled and canceled, every time I sat in the back of the chamber and watched the galaxy make decisions about humanity without ever asking humanity what it thought. The station had been disorienting at first. The architecture was designed for species with different proportions, different sensory ranges, different ways of measuring space. The corridors were too wide, the ceilings too high, the angles wrong in ways that made my eyes ache. The air had a chemical tang that I had never fully adjusted to, a sharpness that clung to the back of my throat. The sounds were wrong, too. The echoes did not behave the way my ears expected, bouncing off surfaces that absorbed and reflected in patterns I could not predict. I had spent my first year here learning to read the silence. The Empire's delegates did not need to threaten. They simply did not respond. They let the silence do the work. A request ignored was a request denied. A question unanswered was a question that should not have been asked. The institution was the antagonist, and it operated with perfect internal logic. Over the next decade, I watched the pattern repeat. Trade routes shifted. Access was reduced. Communications were delayed. Each change was small, incremental, legally defensible. Each one was documented, filed, archived. The Empire was building a framework that would make resistance impossible without violating the very laws they had written. I had prepared, not in a way that would be noticed, not in a way that would trigger the alarms that the Empire had placed in every system they could monitor. I had archived star charts that were supposed to be obsolete. I had memorized old military frequency lists that had been retired decades ago. I had built a mental map of every dormant relay, every abandoned communication node, every piece of infrastructure that the Empire had stopped watching because they assumed it was dead. The network was not dead. It was waiting. Seo Jun shifted on the cot. The fabric rustled. He cleared his throat, a small sound that felt loud in the silence. "I have another message," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. He had learned that from me. I looked up. The datapad was still face down on the desk, but I could feel its presence, a weight in the room that had nothing to do with gravity. He held out his own datapad. The screen was lit. I took it. The message was from long-range sensors, relayed through the emergency network, encoded with an authentication protocol that had not been used since the last human war. The Empire's fleet had been detected moving through the demilitarized Corridor 7 Alpha, a route that had been closed to military traffic for 47 years. Estimated arrival at the station, 6 hours. I set the second datapad beside the first. The two devices lay on the desk, side by side, their screens dark now, their messages absorbed. I had 11 years of accumulated data, 11 years of watching, 11 years of knowing what this moment would look like. The Empire had spent 3 years writing laws to make humans defenseless. They had spent 47 years assuming the dormant relays were dead. They had spent 11 years watching me file objections and sit in the back of the chamber and never once raise my voice. They had not checked the old relay, the one that connected to a human installation that the galaxy had stopped monitoring years ago, the one that had been dark for 40 years, the one that, when I sent the signal, would wake something that the Empire had forgotten existed. I reached under the desk into the space where the wall panel met the floor and pressed the release that I had installed 11 years ago. The panel shifted. I pulled it aside and lifted out a small encrypted case, no larger than a book, its surface cool and smooth. I had brought this case with me when I arrived. I had never opened it. I had never needed to, until now. The case had a single code lock, mechanical, no power source. I entered the combination, a date, a name, a number that I had memorized but never written down. The lock released with a sound like a held breath. Inside was a single data rod, gray, unmarked, and a handwritten note on paper that had yellowed with age. The handwriting was familiar, the precise, angular script of an admiral I had served under years ago, before this posting, before the Empire began its slow consolidation of power. The note said, "If you ever send the signal, we will answer. It will not be fast. It will not be subtle." I read the note twice. Then I placed it back in the case, closed the lid, and slid the case into my pocket. Seo-Jun watched me. His hands were still clasped between his knees. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "What do we do?" he asked. I looked at the two datapads on the desk. I looked at the encrypted case in my pocket. I looked at the viewport, where the station's inner ring rotated slowly, indifferent, carrying its sleeping population through the dark. "We send the signal," I said. The message was 7 words. I composed it on the datapad, my thumb moving across the screen with the precision of someone who had been preparing this sentence for years. I did not hesitate. I did not read it back. I simply typed the words and pressed send. The old relay received the transmission. It had been dormant for 40 years, but its circuits were intact. Its power source still charged, its authentication protocols still active. The relay accepted the message and forwarded it through a chain of dark nodes, each one waking in sequence, each one passing the signal along. The galaxy had forgotten the relay existed, but the relay had not forgotten its purpose. I set the datapad down. The station's systems continued their quiet routines. The environmental hum continued. The lights remained dim. The corridors remained empty. But somewhere in the dark, between the stars, Something that had been waiting for this moment was already moving. The message was 7 words. I sent it through the old relay, the one that had been dark for 40 years, the one the galaxy had forgotten existed. The relay was a ghost in the network, a remnant from the first wave of human expansion, when we still believed that diplomatic presence meant physical infrastructure. The Empire had ordered it decommissioned during the treaty negotiations, a gesture of good faith, they said. We complied. We always complied. But compliance does not mean erasure. The relay still existed. The power cells still held charge. The encryption protocols still functioned. And no one had thought to check whether we had actually disconnected the hardware. I typed the message on a handheld terminal in my quarters, my thumb pressing each character with deliberate care. The screen glowed faintly in the dim light, casting shadows across the worn brass watch on my wrist. 7 words. No more. The protocol required brevity. The relay's bandwidth was narrow, and the transmission window would be measured in milliseconds before the Empire's censored net detected the burst. The words I sent were not a plea. They were not a call for rescue. They were a single, precise instruction, coded in a language that had been obsolete for 3 decades, addressed to a listening post that officially did not exist. I pressed send. The terminal confirmed transmission. The relay went dark again. Seo Jun stood in the doorway, his gray hoodie dark against the pale wall of the corridor. He had not spoken since we left the council chamber. He did not need to. His stillness told me everything. "It's done," I said. He nodded once. Then he held up his own datapad, the screen angled toward me. The Empire's fleet had been confirmed on long-range sensors. 47 warships, moving in formation through a corridor that was supposed to be demilitarized. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. I sat down on the edge of my cot, the thin mattress creaking under my weight. The station hummed around us. The environmental system cycling, the distant thrum of the power core, the occasional click of a thermal expansion joint. Normal sounds. The sounds of a station that did not yet know it was about to become a battlefield. The Council's automated systems are broadcasting the new classification, Seo Jun said, his voice flat. Human non-combatant status is now official. The station's defense grid has been remotely locked down. I had expected this. The treaty included provisions for the automatic deactivation of all defensive systems on stations classified as non-combatant. It was a standard clause, one we had argued against for 3 years. We had filed 22 formal objections. We had submitted 5 alternative frameworks. We had requested a review by the Independent Oversight Committee, a committee that had not convened in 47 years. Every objection had been recorded. Every request had been denied. They are already moving through the corridors, Seo Jun said. Alien security. They are confining all human personnel to quarters. I stood. The motion was automatic, driven by something older than conscious thought. 11 years on this station, and I had developed a map of its maintenance tunnels that no one else possessed. The Empire's security forces knew the public routes, the main corridors, the diplomatic wings. They did not know the spaces between the walls. "Come with me," I said. The maintenance tunnels were narrow, the ceilings low enough that I had to duck in places. The air was stale, thick with the smell of recycled metal and old lubricant. Our footsteps echoed on grated flooring, the sound sharp and irregular. Seo Jun followed without question, his quick, light steps matching my deliberate pace. We passed a junction where a single panel had been pried open, revealing a tangle of cables and conduits. I paused, running my fingers along the exposed wiring. The station's main data core was 3 levels below us, buried in the heart of the structure. The old human diplomatic office was 2 levels above it, abandoned for years, but still connected to the core through a hard line that had never been officially documented. I had discovered it during my 2nd year on the station. A junior technician had shown me, offhandedly, as a piece of trivia. This old line still works, but no one uses it. I had memorized the route, the access codes, the power requirements. I had never told anyone. The Empire's security patrols moved through the main corridors above us, their footsteps a muffled rhythm on the deck plates. We waited in the darkness, pressed against the wall, until the sound faded. The diplomatic office was exactly as I remembered it. A small room, windowless, with a single desk and a chair that had been bolted to the floor. The walls were bare. We had removed all our insignia when the office was closed. But the hardline connection was still there, a port in the wall behind the desk, covered by a panel that had been painted over so many times it was almost invisible. I pried the panel open with the edge of my watch band. The port was clean, unused for years but functional. I connected my terminal. The Council's data core was vast, containing centuries of records, treaties, amendments, and classified addenda. I navigated through layers of access permissions, using credentials that had been issued to a human diplomat who had retired 10 years ago. The Empire had never revoked those credentials. They had simply assumed no one would use them. I found what I was looking for. The Empire's full plan, embedded in the treaty's supplementary documents, was a systematic elimination of human diplomatic presence across the galaxy. The reclassification was the first phase. The second phase was the seizure of human assets and territories, justified by the non-combatant designation. There would be no legal recourse. The treaty had been written to ensure that. Seo Jun found the classified addendum. His face went pale as he read it, his fingers tightening on the datapad. "They intend to take everything," he said. "Every station, every colony, every ship in transit. They have already identified targets. The schedule is, precise." I did not respond. I was already uploading a data packet through the hardline. Not a message, but a broadcast key. A single encrypted file that would activate every dormant relay in human space. The Empire had assumed that decommissioning the relays would silence us. They had not realized that we had built them to be reactivated. The packet uploaded in seconds. The hardline disconnected. The station's main power flickered. The lights dimmed, then returned, but the hum of the environmental systems changed pitch. Something was happening. The Council chamber's main display changed. The holographic treaty seal vanished, replaced by a single line of text in standard galactic script. Non-combatant classification accepted. All defense obligations terminated. I stood in the dark office, watching the words on my terminal. The Empire's own treaty language used against them. They had written the provisions. They had defined the terms. They had never imagined that anyone would read them more carefully than they had. The station's alarms began to sound. Not the general evacuation, something older, something I had never heard in the 11 years I had served here. A deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the deck plates, through the walls, through my chest. Seo Jun looked at me, his eyes wide. "That's not a station alarm," he said. I shook my head. "That's a fleet alarm, human fleet." The Empire's warships had paused at the edge of the system. They had detected something they had not expected. A formation of human vessels, running dark, had just appeared on their sensors. The galaxy learned something that day about patience, about preparation, about what it means to be classified as something small, and about what happens when the small thing finally decides to move. The station's alarms began to sound. Not the general evacuation, something older, something I had never heard in the 11 years I had served here. It was a low, grinding tone, like metal being pulled apart slowly, a sound that seemed to come from the station's bones rather than its speakers. I felt it in my chest before I recognized it as an alarm. Seo Jun was already at the door, his hand on the frame, his head tilted, as if listening to something beyond the sound. "That's not in the manual," he said. "No," I replied. "It's not." The second shock wave hit before I could finish the thought. The floor lurched beneath my feet, and I caught myself against the wall, my palm flat against the cold metal, feeling the vibration travel up through my arm. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized at a dimmer setting. The environmental hum shifted, a change in pitch that meant something had been damaged, something structural. I looked at the encrypted case still open on the floor, the data rod glinting in the low light. The Admiral's note was in my hand. I had not realized I had picked it up. "We need to move," I said. The corridors were chaos, not the chaos of panic. The station's non-human population had been through evacuations before, and they moved with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. But there was a tension in the air, a frequency of voices that was higher than normal, a density of bodies that pressed against the walls. The security patrols were everywhere, their black armor catching the emergency lighting, their visors sweeping across the crowds with a methodical precision that made my skin prickle. We did not run. Running would have drawn attention. We walked at the pace of people who had somewhere to be, who were not lost, who were not afraid. I kept my hand in my pocket, the data rod pressed against my palm, its edges sharp against my skin. The maintenance tunnel entrance was behind a panel in the old human diplomatic office, a room that had been locked and sealed for 3 years. The lock was electronic, tied to the Council's security network. I had spent the first 6 months of my posting memorizing the schematics of this station, mapping every access point, every forgotten corridor, every place where a human could go unnoticed. The lock's override code was the date of the treaty ratification. The Empire had used the same date for every security system on the station. They had never changed it. They had never thought anyone would need to. The panel slid open with a soft click, and the tunnel beyond was dark, narrow, and smelled of old metal and recycled air that had been still for too long. I stepped through first, Seo Jun close behind, and the panel closed behind us, sealing us into a silence that was almost absolute. The tunnel ran for half a kilometer, following the curve of the station's outer hull. The only light came from the emergency strips along the floor, barely enough to see by, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in the confined space like a heartbeat. I counted the junctions as we passed them. 7 left turns, 3 right, 2 straight sections, matching the schematic I had memorized 11 years ago. The old human diplomatic office was at the end of the last straight section. The door was manual, a heavy steel slab that required both hands to pull open. It groaned on its hinges, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The room inside was exactly as I had left it 3 years ago. A desk, a chair, a terminal that had been disconnected from the station's network, a small metal cabinet that had been empty when I locked the door. I crossed to the terminal and knelt beside it, running my fingers along the back panel until I found the access port, a hardline connection that bypassed the station's security network entirely, a relic from the early days of human diplomatic presence on the station, before the Empire had tightened its control. The data rod slid into the port with a satisfying click. The terminal screen flickered to life, a single line of text appearing in the dim green glow of the old display. Connection established, awaiting command. I typed the command from memory. It was simple. Only 4 characters, a code that had been given to me on my first day of service 11 years ago by an admiral who had looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "If you ever need to reach us directly, use this. It will not work through the normal channels. It will not be traced. It will be heard." The screen went dark for a moment, then displayed a single word. Acknowledged. The upload began. The data packet I had prepared, the Empire's full plan, the classified addendum, the legal framework they intended to use, the coordinates of the fleet, the timeline of the operation, streamed through the hardline, through the old relay that had been dark for 40 years, through the network of dormant connections that the galaxy had forgotten existed. It would reach human space in approximately 4 hours. By then, the Empire's fleet would be here, but the signal had been sent. The preparation was complete. The only thing left was to wait. I sat in the chair behind the desk and watched the terminal screen cycle through the transmission progress. Seo Jun stood by the door, his hand resting on the manual release, his eyes scanning the dark tunnel beyond. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The transmission completed in 47 minutes. I disconnected the data rod and slipped it back into my pocket. The terminal screen went dark. The room was silent. The station's alarms began to sound again, not the grinding tone from before, but a higher, more urgent pitch, a sound that I recognized from the training simulations. The Empire's fleet had arrived. I stood up and walked to the door. Seo Jun pulled it open, and we stepped back into the maintenance tunnel, the alarms following us through the darkness, a persistent reminder that the galaxy had just changed. The Empire's ambassador stood at the center of the council chamber alone, staring at a single line of text on the main display. It said, "Non-Combatant classification accepted. All defense obligations terminated." The Empire's ambassador stood at the center of the council chamber, alone, staring at a single line of text on the main display. It said, "Non-Combatant classification accepted. All defense obligations terminated." I watched him from the old diplomatic office, the display flickering on a cracked screen that had been dark for 6 years. The ambassador's mouth moved, but the public channel was silent. He was speaking to his own command, I realized, telling them what the treaty they had written now meant. Seo Jun stood beside me, her hand resting on the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "They're holding position," she said. "The fleet. They're not firing." I had expected this. The Empire's legal framework was their greatest weapon and their deepest vulnerability. They had spent 3 years building a cage for humanity, and they had built it out of their own laws. Every clause, every definition, every carefully worded exception, it was all theirs. And now, those words had turned around. The station's internal systems were still broadcasting the new classification. I could hear it in the automated announcements cycling through the corridors, the same sterile voice repeating the same phrase. "Non-combatant status confirmed. All defense obligations terminated." The Empire's own treaty language, read back to them by their own machines. The ambassador's face was visible on the main display now. He was not angry. He was confused. His model of the galaxy had no entry for this, a species that had been classified as non-combatant, that had accepted the classification, and that had then used that classification to dismantle the entire legal basis for the operation against them. He turned, slowly, and looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting to the station. His eyes were pale gray, and for a moment I saw something I had never seen in an Azaran diplomat before: uncertainty. The human fleet appeared on the edge of the system 30 minutes later. They had been running dark for years, waiting for this exact moment. I knew their names, their hull numbers, the specific dates they had slipped out of monitored space. I had helped plan their departure. 41 ships, each one carrying the same message. They were here to provide humanitarian escort under the terms of the treaty the Empire had just ratified. The Empire's fleet commander sent a request for clarification. The human fleet commander replied with a single line of text. Non-combatant species has requested safe passage. Treaty 847-NCC grants us the right to provide humanitarian escort. We are acting within the legal framework you established. I watched the exchange on the cracked screen, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter. The recognition that every year I had spent being patient, every formal objection I had filed, every session I had attended and been dismissed from, had been worth it. Sao Jun let out a breath I had not realized she was holding. "They're moving," she said. "The human ships. They're forming an evacuation corridor." The evacuation took 4 hours. It was methodical, precise, and fully documented. Every step was recorded, every communication logged, every movement timed and verified. The Empire's fleet watched from a distance, unable to act, trapped by the legal framework they had designed to trap us. I was the last to leave the station. I walked through the empty corridors, past the council chamber where I had been dismissed for 11 years, past the offices where my objections had been filed and ignored, past the viewport where I had watched the stars slide past on the first night I arrived. The airlock was open. The human transport vessel was waiting. I paused at the threshold, one hand on the cold metal frame, and I looked back. The station's lights were dimming. The automated systems were cycling through their shutdown sequences. The council chamber was dark. The seats where the delegates had sat were empty. I turned and stepped through the airlock. The transport's interior was warm and smelled of recycled air and coffee. A young lieutenant with a calm face gestured me to a seat. I sat down, and the hatch sealed behind me. The human fleet formed a protective formation around the transport vessels. They did not engage the Empire's ships. They did not need to. The treaty was the weapon, and it had already done its work. The galaxy learned something that day about patience, about preparation, about what it means to be classified as something small, and about what happens when the small thing finally decides to move. I sat in the transport, watching the station recede through a small viewport. The Empire's fleet was still holding position, their ships dark against the stars, their commanders still trying to understand what had just happened. They had spent 3 years making sure humans couldn't fight back legally. They had forgotten that humans had spent centuries learning to read the fine print. They had forgotten that a species that could build a civilization from scratch, that could survive its own mistakes, that could look at the void and decide to fill it with something. They had forgotten that such a species does not stop being dangerous just because it stops fighting. The war that everyone expected did not happen that day, but something else did. Something that would take the galaxy years to understand. The human fleet moved through the system at a steady pace, every ship following its designated course, every communication logged, every action documented. We were not running. We were not attacking. We were simply leaving, with full legal authority, under the protection of a treaty the Empire had written to destroy us. I watched the stars slide past the viewport, the same way I had watched them on the first night I arrived. The station was a distant point of light now, growing smaller with every passing moment. Seo-jun sat across from me, her datapad dark, her eyes fixed on the same viewport. She did not say anything, neither did I. There was nothing left to say. The records were filed, the objections were documented, the response had been delivered. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the galaxy was beginning to understand that it had made a catastrophic miscalculation, not about human strength, but about human patience. We had waited, we had prepared, and when the moment came, we had been ready. The Empire's ambassador stood alone in the empty council chamber, staring at the single line of text on the main display. It was still there, still glowing in the dim light, still delivering its quiet verdict. Non-combatant classification accepted. All defense obligations terminated. He had written those words. He'd pushed them through every committee, every vote, every procedural hurdle. He had believed they would be the end of us. They were not. They were the beginning of something else, something that the galaxy would spend years trying to understand, and years more trying to forget. But some lessons cannot be unlearned, and some patience is not a virtue. It is a warning.